inclusive, informed California electorate. My name is Arnie Sowell, and I'm the Executive Director of NextGen Policy. We're a nonprofit organization that's based in California and that advocates for justice and equity across a range of policy issues. Everything from climate change to affordable housing, to access to healthcare, to criminal justice reform, to higher education affordability, and much more. NextGen Policy is very pleased to have helped organize today's event because we care deeply about the equity and justice issues involved in our election system and are firmly dedicated to trying to create a more diverse, inclusive, and informed California voting public. We also know that the core of our democracy is foundationally centered in the issues of equity and justice, and that voting and its accessibility to all is the only way that we're going to advance many of the issues that we care so deeply about. It's the only way we can advance them from an organizational standpoint, in coalition, or as a state governmental entity. We must allow and make sure that everyone's voice is heard, especially those who are not represented by our current system. That's why, since our inception some 6 years ago, NextGen was strongly supportive of a number of different pieces of legislation, as well as budget items, legislation, for instance, that actually gave us our vote by mail system through the Voters' Choice Act, that's helped to sort of ease the pathway for folks that have some discrepancy around signature verification around election time, to give them more time in order to sort of clear those things up, as well as we're super supportive in this year's current budget of more funding for voter outreach. Tomorrow is the election day in California, and it is extremely important that everyone gets out to vote. But I think here's some of the things that we may see when we look at tomorrow and the results of tomorrow from an electorate standpoint. And that is that many of the income and racial groups where there are gaps in registration and their lack thereof, we will continue to see that. There are over 4 million eligible California voters who are not registered to vote. Younger Californians, low-income Californians, and Californians of color make up the majority of that cohort of folks who are unregistered. We're here today to discuss what can be done to close that gap and in the number of unregistered voters. And not to give too much away from the panel discussion, but it turns out that there are some rather simple and relatively modest programmatic and policy tweaks that we can make in order to do that. NextGen has helped to author a report on this subject and has made some specific recommendations around this particular question. And I'm looking forward to the panel discussion today. I'm especially looking forward to hearing from the Colorado Secretary of State, Jenna Griswold, and I want to thank her for her participation. There's a lot that we can learn from what Colorado has done on this subject, and a ton that they can teach us about voter registration. And so with that, as an opening welcome and introduction, I'd like to turn it over to Neil Urbiani. Neil is the policy and the research director for at the Institute of Responsive Government, and he'll serve as today's moderator, and we'll introduce our panel. Neil, take it away.
Great, thanks so much, Arnie. As Arnie mentioned, I'm Neil Brianni. I'm the Policy and Research Director at the Institute for Responsive Government. We're a relatively new project of the Center for Secure and Modern Elections and the Center for Tech and Civic Life that focuses on practical solutions to make government more efficient and accessible, with automatic voter registration as one of sort of the foremost areas of work. I want to introduce our really distinguished panel here today, and to invite them to sort of be part of a really interesting conversation about how states like Colorado are optimizing automatic voter registration. Just a few housekeeping items before I introduce the panel. Everyone should be muted. If you find yourself unmuted, please mute yourself, just as a courtesy. This event is being recorded. And finally, to just please save your questions for the conclusion of the event. We'll leave time, about 15 minutes at the end, for questions. You can ask your questions through the Q&A function, or you can raise your hand during the question and answer period. and our moderator will spotlight you, and you can ask a question then for the panelists. And one other note, Secretary Jenna Griswold will be joining the panel. She's running just a bit late, so she should be joining us shortly. With that, I'm going to introduce our panelists, starting with the ones who are on screen right now. Amy Hamlin is a policy advisor at NextGen Policy, focused on voting rights, civic engagement, digital equality, and workforce development issues. Most recently, she was a policy advisor to Governor Newsom's Business and Jobs Recovery Task Force. Before joining NGP, Amy worked as a policy advisor on Tom Steyer's presidential campaign. She began her career on the 2008 Obama campaign, managing an online community of nearly 2 million supporters. She is passionate about strengthening democratic participation at home and abroad. And in addition to her work with NGP, Amy teaches in the political science department at Contra Costa College. Next is Professor Justin Grimmer. Justin Grimmer is a professor in Stanford University's Department of Political Science. His research interests include Congress, representation, and political methodology. His research examines how communication occurs in politics. He also uses and develops machine learning algorithms to examine large collections of text. He is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and co-director of the Democracy and Polarization Lab. Justin also works with Facebook as a research scientist on the core data science team. Next, Karen Diaz. Karen Diaz is Deputy Director of Civic Engagement at CHIRLA, the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights. She is an experienced electoral campaign and nonprofit manager with a demonstrated history of working in high-profile House races and ballot measures. She is passionate about immigrants' rights, civil liberties, and community organizing. Karen received her bachelor's degree focused in political science communications from the University of California, Davis. And just to introduce Secretary Jenna Griswold, who will be joining us shortly. Jenna Griswold is the Colorado Secretary of State. She was elected as the first Democratic Secretary of State in Colorado in 60 years in 2018, and became the first Democratic woman Secretary of State in Colorado's history. Secretary Griswold has been able to lead and work with the legislature to pass one of the largest democracy reform packages in the nation as Secretary of State. She grew up in a working class family in rural Colorado and was the first person in her family to attend a four-year college and then law school. She knows firsthand how important it is for every vote to count and for every Coloradan's voice to be heard, no matter their background or income. She is fighting to protect the right to vote, stop secret political spending, and improve transparency. So as Arnie mentioned, we are here today to talk about a report being released by NextGen, Expanding California's Electorate, a discussion on optimizing automatic voter registration systems. And there's Secretary Griswold joining us now. Thank you, Secretary. And so just to give a brief background on the report, I want to turn it over to Amy to summarize the findings of the report before we move to a panel discussion.
Sure. Thanks so much, Neil. Thank you to everyone for joining us today for this important conversation and discussion, and especially to Secretary Griswold. Thank you so much. First, I just wanted to start off with just a little bit of context about how NextGen Policy, which is really a California-based organization, put out this report and why we came to look at the example and the case study of Colorado and what it might tell us about what we can do in California to further improve our voter registration rates, because we have had some really good success in recent years, but we think we can still build upon that. And our Secretary of State here, Secretary Weber, often likes to say that she will not rest until we get to that 100% figure. So that's kind of what our eyes are on. It's ambitious, but we still think we have further to go, and there are some simple changes that can be made to get us there. So as our executive director, Arnie Sowell, has mentioned, NextGen really kind of comes at this from an interest in civic engagement and voting and improving voting rates and voter participation, especially because of our interest in equity and justice. And we think that, of course, voting is really central to achieving that and making sure that more people are voting, more people, especially from underrepresented groups right now. And to take a further step back, just some additional kind of context about automatic voter registrations, which we're going to be talking about today. In the US, automatic voter registration systems have really emerged in the last 6 years or so, 6 to 7 years, in about 20 states. And because we have this great federal system, many states have adopted a little bit different versions of AVR, and that gives us a natural experiment to look at and to take some policy lessons from. So in California, we've adopted what I would consider to be a partially automatic voter registration system, which is also referred to as a front-end voter registration system. And some of you know this well, but just to kind of simplify it a little bit and just to explain some of the terminology, a front-end automatic voter registration system means that when you go to the DMV in California, you will be asked up front on a screen if you are interested in registering to vote, or if you'd like to update your voter registration information. And then if you're a citizen and eligible to register to vote. And that information will then be transmitted, if relevant, to the Secretary of State's office, and they will register you to vote or update your voter registration information. So that's called a front-end system. Colorado and a number of other states have what I consider to be a fully automatic voter registration system. It's also referred to as a back-end system. And so how that works is that agencies like the DMV, or it could be, in some cases, a Medicaid office that already verify citizenship status as part of their normal course of business, they automatically register all known eligible customers who are interacting with their office, automatically transmitting that information to a Secretary of State's office. So you're no longer being asked, upfront, are you a citizen? Are you eligible? Because they already know that. And so it's removing just an administrative hurdle. And I think from NextGen's perspective, we think that voting and voter registration should be as easy and streamlined as possible. And so our interest was really kind of looking at that system, that back-end system that's been implemented in other states, and seeing, is it worthwhile for California, which has a front-end system, to make that transition. And our interest in looking at Colorado was that it's been the first state to make that transition from a California-style front-end system to a more streamlined back-end system. And so we thought it was a great kind of case study for us to look at, to draw some conclusions about what other states might learn and what the benefits are that they might see if they make a similar change. And so we have about 2 years of data from Colorado since they've implemented this back-end system. And I have to say that I was very, very pleasantly surprised by kind of the scale of the impact there. And I guess just to give you a few of the top lines from the report, the voter registration rate at the DMV nearly doubled within that 2-year time horizon. The pre-registration rate for 16 and 17-year-olds at the DMV more than doubled, went up 173%. And we also estimate that about 33% of outdated voter addresses and other information were updated that would not have been otherwise updated. So we think that that is just really, really impressive. We're so happy that kind of Colorado has given us a blueprint for making that transition and giving us some sense of what the benefits are that we might expect to see if California and other states make a similar transition. So I'll leave it there for now, Neil. I'm sure there's a lot to dig into there. I'm just trying to give a few top lines. And I would just end by, really applauding Secretary Griswold and her team for implementing these changes, and I think really showing what's possible.
Thanks, Amy. And I think that's a perfect segue to our next question. Secretary Griswold, I think Amy's talked a little bit about sort of the how. I think we want to talk about the why. Tell us more about Colorado's AVR story. Why did the state decide to upgrade, its good AVR system to, I think what Amy is suggesting might be like a best in the nation system? What would be your message to other states, including California, that are considering such a change?
Yes, we went from good to great, and thank you all for having me on. And by the way, Amy, one of the things that I think is really neat about our new system, before getting into the why, is that when voter registration drives were not happening in 2020, we ended up registering 250,000 people, which was just super impressive. And we were so glad that we were able to implement this new AVR system. So to answer the why, Neil, I was elected in 2018, and then in 2019, I led the largest democracy reform in the nation, with the goal of expanding access to the voting box, increasing our security, and then, of course, fighting back on political corruption through campaign finance and lobbyist reform. So one of the major implementations in
Oh, I think the secretary might have frozen. We'll give her a chance to come back online. Secretary Griswold, if you can hear us, you're frozen. So we'll just take a pause and come back to you. I think, Professor Grimmer, if I could turn to you for a second. You and your colleague, Jonathan Roden at Stanford, have done sort of a more statistically involved analysis of the data that Amy, Secretary Griswold, you're back. I apologize.
Gosh, that government internet kicks you off. No, I'm sorry about that. I didn't know if it was me or all of us. Sorry about that. But anyhow, we implemented the program. It did streamline interactions with the DMV. It turns out people don't like going to the DMV. So if you can make it as easy as possible, that's always the best way to go. It also reduces the possibility of human error, and our new system provides a more convenient options to citizens by reducing the number of trips to government agencies, particularly for working people with multiple jobs, rural folks who may not live close to government offices. And I think it's really important when thinking about government services to put yourself in the shoes of everyday people. And everyday people expect government to just work as government. The people who pick up the garbage are the same as the President of the United States. It's all government. So it should be as streamlined as possible. But we all know that government is so segmented. And so if we can make one interaction with government at the DMV suddenly, get streamlined into various agencies, it just takes down the burden and makes it easier for people to get registered. But these reforms, they've been really great. They increased the number of eligible voters registered and supported maintenance of voter rolls, which of course reduces costs and increases security. You want your ballots to go to where they're intended to go. And I think we should always be looking for new ways to improve the voter registration process and ensure that every eligible voter is able to be registered in a way that is accessible, simple, and secure. And that's what this AVR system does.
Thank you so much. Professor Grimmer, I was sort of moving towards you at the next moment. You and your colleague, Jonathan Roden at Stanford, have also looked at the Stanford data, and you found conclusions that they're generally the same as what NextGen has found, correct? In terms of the impact on the number of new registrations, the number of updates, right?
That's right. Yeah. Not only do we find a large increase in the number of new registrations, we also find a large increase in the number of pre-registrations.
I think one of the pieces of your article that was most interesting was sort of there's a pool of people that are going through who provide proof of citizenship, who sort of demonstrate their eligibility when they interact with the DMV, and they're going through this ultra streamlined flow. There's people who may not be providing that information, whether it's sort of a license renewal. There's features of the Colorado system that still benefit those people. That's right.
That's right. Yeah. So when you provide that information, for example, it can help you with change of address and maintaining the voter roll, which is a really important component. Right.
And I think you estimated for almost hundreds of thousands of new updates that would have not otherwise occurred without the system, correct?
Yes, that's exactly right. So what's remarkable about this reform, not only does it have a big immediate effect, that effect seems to persist, which is really I think encouraging. And when we're thinking about individuals who have moved, it's often quite cumbersome to update your registration. It's not a thing you're thinking about because you moved and you're much more worried about everything else, like getting your internet service provider changed and your cable changed. And so when someone goes to the DMV to get the new address, this provides this opportunity to do this in a relatively easy way. And this has affected a large number of individuals.
Mm-hmm. I kind of want to talk, Karen, I want to turn to you because Secretary Griswold mentioned people who sort of want government to work as easily as possible. And as part of an organization that works in civic engagement, who are the types of people who may decline voter registration when they're asked as part of a DMV interaction, but sort of would like to be registered down the road, but don't want to spend time at the DMV. if you have experience with those types of communities.
Yeah, so these are people like young voters, people if you're 16, 17, they might ask you to pre-register to vote. And as a young person, you're not thinking about voting at that time. This might not be your priority. People who have a job to get to and they think that is going to take a significantly long amount of time, or even people that are their primary language is not English. They might be interacting with someone at the DMV who might only speak English, and they might not understand the question that's being asked of them and might erroneously say yes to the citizenship question, or they might just reject it flat out because they don't think they're eligible, either because their background and criminal history, and they might be eligible to do it. So just taking the decision away from people and just having people who are eligible for this processes and making it as seamlessly as possible, it would turn it to people like us who do the get out the vote efforts. More important to just like, instead of registering them, we'll be focusing on just helping them, tell them when the elections are happening, how they can be voting, and why it's important to go out and vote.
And I want to be clear, Amy, this isn't mandatory registration, right? This is just sort of a more streamlined system that people can still opt out of, correct?
That's exactly right. Thanks for that, Neil, because I think it's an important point to clarify that when you're moving from a front-end system or looking at a front-end system versus a back-end system, both provide the opportunity to opt out. It's just a matter of when you're being provided that opportunity. So with a front-end system, as the name might suggest, it's an upfront opportunity. I would, in fact, call it preemptive opt-out because you're being asked before you're even being registered to vote. Do you want to, depending on the state, do you want to register to vote? Or sometimes the question is, do you want to decline the opportunity to register to vote, or some variation of that question, and that's being asked to you while you're still at the DMV. In a back-end system, which is what Colorado has moved toward, you're asked and given that opportunity to opt out after the fact. So you go to the DMV, for example, in Colorado, and Secretary Griswold, I'm sure, can speak to this more, but you go to the DMV, they see that you already are eligible. They automatically register you to vote, and then you get a mailer afterwards saying, hey, you've been registered to vote. If you'd like to opt out, send back this prepaid postage mailer and let us know. So it's not mandatory, but we do think it's important to move toward that more streamlined system. And I think the reason is because most people prefer a streamlined system. They don't actually want to opt out. And I think that's what the research shows. And I think Professor Grimmer's paper that looks at some of the kind of behavioral economic aspects of this kind of gets into that there are many reasons why someone might decline when asked at a DMV, but they in fact want to be registered to vote. And so that's what that population is being captured by the back-end system.
That's right. Professor Grimmer, you talk about this sort of in the context of sort of nudge theory, which we've heard about in behavioral economics. You might consider front-end AVR sort of a weak nudge to say, would you like to register? And back-end AVR is a really strong nudge to say, we're going to register you unless you, make the effort to send this back. Is that sort of an accurate way to describe it?
That's right. It's all about the default. And so here the default option is we're going to register you to vote. And you can, of course, opt out. There's going to be a mailer and you can send it back. But it turns out there's very few reasons not want to be registered to vote. People tend to want to participate in elections. Registration's this barrier. And it's clear from the data, there's very few mailers that are returned. So the key thing here is really changing this default so that the default is that you're added to the registration rolls.
And Secretary Griswold, what does it mean, particularly in a vote by mail state like Colorado, to just have, hundreds of thousands or millions more people on the rolls?
Well, it means more people end up voting. But on top of that, of course, it saves money for the county clerks. It makes our elections more secure. And overall, it's been going really well in Colorado, and we're looking to expand it even further.
Can you talk a little bit more about that expansion?
Sure. So when we were developing our legislation back in 2019, we made sure that the DMV would be the first place, but to leave it open in the law to be able to expand to other agencies. So we're currently working to implement the same system as what's at the driver's license offices at our state Medicaid offices. We need to be meeting voters where they are. Registering shouldn't mean, having to find a maze of state agencies to get registered to cast a ballot. But on top of that, we're doing something really neat that I'm excited about, is that we're in conversations about a pilot for tribal AVR using tribal ID. And that's something I'm really excited about also. Ultimately, every eligible voter, no matter their age, as long as they're qualified, of course, zip code or amount of money in their bank account, should be able to register and vote in our elections in a way that's accessible. That's what makes democracy stronger. And frankly, AVR pushes back on the false equivalence that you can't have access and security. The opposite is actually true. Increased access through programs like Vote by Mail for All, AVR, increases our security. So it's not even a win-win. It's like a win-win-win-win-win. So hopefully the rest of the nation catches up, because it's going pretty well out here.
Well, I think it's you said win-win-win-win-win. I think there's one win you left out for sort of organizations like CHRLA. I know some of the biggest advocates for AVR improvement in Colorado are organizations like the Alliance for Youth Action and Next Up. And so for organizations like CHRLA, what would it mean to have sort of better voter rolls or more complete voter rolls in terms of voter outreach, Karen?
So right now in this election, we're seeing that there's been very low turnout for the primaries that are happening tomorrow, and it's really concerning. We spend a lot of money, a lot of time, and a lot of our volunteers' energies. And when we go to the door and we don't find someone because their address is updated, there's no other way for us to reach these folks. We want to meet them where they're at by knocking on their doors, calling them their phone numbers, and their phone numbers are updated. And the voters that we're talking to are people who right now, a lot of them face a lot of difficulties due to the pandemic, and a lot of them weren't able to pay their cell phone bills. So they lost their cell phone number. And there's nobody to tell them that they need to update their phone number. There's nobody who tell them you need to re-register and have an updated address, as they might be living in multi-generational households, and they might have to move to garages, temporary housing. And these are the people that need democracy to work for them, and we're not there to support them. So with a system like this, who's working for them, whether they're going to a DMV or a service like getting healthcare or getting temporary houses from the government, they're going to be able to, be participating in democracy, and we're going to be able to reach them where they're at, regardless what election is, whether it's a primary election, presidential election, even a special elections that we've seen happening a lot here in California, even last year.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's crucial in a state. And not so I've been in a state like California, like Colorado, that has recently moved to vote by mail. Just making sure that those mail ballots reach the correct address. I think, Amy, can you talk a little bit more about sort of how the address updates component of this would work at the DMV and potentially Medicaid in a state like California?
Sure, I think it would work the same as it works right now in Colorado, which is that it's much more streamlined. So when I was going over just some of kind of the top lines from our report, I don't think I probably touched on this point or didn't highlight it enough, which is that if you're someone who's already registered to vote and you go into the DMV, instead of being asked, do you want to register to vote, or do you want to update your information, under a backend system, any updates that you make to your name or your address will automatically be transmitted to the Secretary of State's office. So that information will be automatically updated. And that's a really, I think, important thing when you have universal mail-in balloting system like we do now in California, making sure that those mail-in ballots get to the voters is crucial, so that people are enfranchised and are able to vote, especially by mail. But it's also important as far as kind of cost savings for the government. I believe in 2020, there were about 300,000 ballots that were returned to sender that the government counties mailed out. because they were, sent to a wrong address or an outdated address, and probably the numbers even higher that were mailed and received somewhere, but didn't actually get to the intended voter.
And that's just in California?
So that's just in California. Hundreds of thousands of ballots in the 2020 election did not make it to the intended voter. And I think we would expect to continue to see similar numbers in the future in California.
And you mentioned sort of saving money. Is that just, undeliverable mail? What are sort of the other cost saving components here?
Sure. So estimates as far as cost savings in California range from $7 to $9 million by moving from California's current system to this more streamlined backend system. And that is from things like not having as many returned ballots, but it also comes from savings in election administration and having to deal with paper ballots and not having to issue as many provisional ballots because someone shows up to vote and their information is out of date. But I would turn it over, I think, to Secretary Griswold, because I'm sure she can talk more about kind of some of the cost savings that they've seen already in Colorado, where those come from.
Absolutely. So basically, the voter rolls are more accurate, which means Amy was hitting it right on the head. Voters get their ballots to the correct address. Counties save on postage from fewer ballots being mailed to the wrong address. The rolls are more secure because the data is also being transferred electronically, reducing the potential for human error. One of the things, Colorado is considered the most accessible, but also most secure state in which to cast a ballot. And we had an eye to security also when drafting our legislation in 2019, where we basically built in provisions that if the security of the technological information exchange was not to our liking, we would shut it down, which just means that we're in deep partnership with the DMV and the department that runs the DMV to make sure that exchange is nice and secure also.
And I think it's important that, the flip side of sort of the access point and the security point, Secretary Griswold, you said, security and access aren't really a trade-off. And I think that's an important thing to emphasize here. And one of the benefits of backend, and I know sort of one of the reasons that Chirla is strongly supporting it in California, is the increased protections for non-citizens. Amy mentioned that if a person provides a document that indicates, clear non-citizenship, like a green card, that person's not going to get the opportunity to register to vote. And that person's not going to have any information transmitted for election purposes. Karen, could you talk more about sort of Chirla's support for this proposal, particularly as it relates to protecting non-citizens?
Yeah, so as a society, I think we should move away from asking our citizenship question in every single form. And this is particularly concerning to me because this year, for the first time, people who, regardless of their status, are able to get healthcare in California. So everyone over the age of 55 is able to register to receive healthcare. And at the places where they can sign up to receive healthcare, there's going to be people without citizenship status. Amongst those are people like my parents and millions of others. I myself, I'm someone who cannot vote, but I know what the laws are for like registering to vote and saying my citizenship status, but I have the privilege of speaking English. When you get people who are not eligible to speak English and don't know it very well, they might be asked these questions. So we just want to move to a system that has added fail safes so that people like this are able to receive healthcare without having to worry to accidentally say that they're citizen when they don't understand the citizenship question in their language. And we know that there isn't always someone that's available to provide this translation services. And this is why we're supporting a system that just helps the people that need to register to vote, so that we can do the second step of following up with them and letting them know when elections are and helping them to go out and vote.
So the concern is, somebody just filling out a long form, they're checking all the boxes. There's a question about citizenship. They just check yes. And suddenly they've made a mistake that can really have catastrophic consequences in terms of immigration in a front end system. And in a back end system, there's sort of that safety check. Did the person provide something that says, that some either a green card or some other documentation that clearly shows they're ineligible? That's sort of the benefit that you see here.
That's correct. And, even for people who have social security systems or work permits, um, we're accidentally sometimes getting forms like asking us to go to jury duty. So if this is happening for people who have like work permits, who have green cards, because they have access to social security cards, and they make this mistakes of like the government makes this mistakes of sending these forms and inviting us to participate in this process when we clearly are not eligible. This would eliminate a lot of this transactions on the government's end, and we just need a system that works for people who don't want to fill out long forms, don't understand how to fill out long forms, and also have complications with understanding the English language.
I think sort of just to tie all this together, I think I'm hearing one thing from all the panelists is sort of if the government has information in its possession, it should use it to sort of register eligible people, to update existing registrations, or to screen out people who the government knows are ineligible. And Professor Grimmer, in your paper, you sort of talked about how this is how registration works in most Western democracies. If you could sort of talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, the US is a real outlier here. So if you look across, for example, Western Europe, registration's the default. The state has either a responsibility to ensure you're registered, or you provide information to the state. For example, in Germany, you have to register where you live, provide that information, and subsequently you're registered to vote because you provided that information. And so moving to this sort of back end system gets us closer to this, not only expectation that the state will have the citizens registered to vote, but that it will use the information that's already being provided to give people access to things like the voting booth.
And I think it's sort of historically, the onus of registration has been on the individual. And Amy, I think you've talked sort of a bit about sort of the history of voter registration and perhaps why that onus has been on the individual historically.
Sure. Well, I think the reason is twofold. The first is that voter registration really kind of came out of the early 1800s and was, not surprisingly given the time frame, a way to exclude and prevent people, especially foreign-born, people of different races, low income, etc., from being able to actually exercise their constitutional right to vote, depending on the time period. And it was meant to intentionally be a barrier to participation. And even though that may not be the motivation today, we certainly are still living, I think, with the legacy of that and the impact on groups today. When you look at patterns of underrepresentation, it's those same groups. And from NextGen's perspective, we think that voter registration is for the most part an unnecessary administrative hurdle that stands in the way of someone's constitutional right to vote.
And just to tie this back, it's sort of moving that onus of registration from the individual to the state, when the state has all the information it needs to know a person is eligible or has moved or is ineligible and should be protected from a mistake in the context of an interaction at the DMV or at Medicaid or some other government agency. Secretary Griswold, I know we only have you for a few more minutes, and thank you for your time today. I wanted to just sort of ask, there are several states that are considering this upgrade in the same way Colorado did, including California through a bill, SB 583. What lessons can California and other states learn from Colorado as they contemplate this change, thinking about sort of pros and cons of adopting it?
Well, number one, thank you for having me. This is a great conversation. And it turns out Amy was so nice. States still use voter registration to suppress on the basis of age, locale, and color of skin. That is a truism. And so the more we can do to make sure that those factors don't determine someone's exercise of their fundamental right, the closer we are to true exercise of Americans' freedom to cast a ballot, Americans' freedom to choose their elected officials. And as someone who grew up on food stamps in rural Colorado, I can tell you firsthand, we would never come to Denver and to imagine having to navigate various or even like big cities all that often when I was growing up, and having to imagine navigating various agencies is something that just may not happen for a lot of folks. So the more that we can streamline as a nation, the easier it will be for eligible people to cast a ballot. And these small changes, I know it's automatic voter registration. It's a small policy change. Once you get in the weeds, it's of course much bigger to implement, but it can bring so many more people who are eligible into the political process so that they can vote, so that they can make our voices heard. And like I mentioned previously, the reforms in Colorado led to over 250,000 Coloradans registering to vote through the system since its implementation in 2020, mid-2020, by the way. And every voter deserves a modernized election system which seamlessly keeps voters' information up to date and makes the voter registration process simple and secure. So I urge other states to follow Colorado's lead. And of course, we are there to assist any state who is interested in implementing or thinking through this process. We would love to see this expanded across the nation. And I just really appreciate you guys focusing on the AVR success that we've had and what can be had across the nation. And thank you for inviting me to this conversation.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Amy, I want to give you the opportunity to sort of tie together this panel discussion before we move to questions from the audience.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Neil. I think we've touched on a lot of the different benefits of back-end AVR system. But I guess just to summarize, because I think we've kind of sprinkled and discussed some of the different benefits throughout. I think, the first is that we've seen from Colorado quite clearly that there is a big bump in voter registration and pre-registration rates at the DMV. And we know from other states that translates into higher overall voter registration and even turnout. We didn't even really, I think, get to that part of the discussion yet. But we know from other states that there is an increase in voter turnout, right? Which is the ultimate goal of all of this. So there's that piece of it, but there's also the cost savings piece from having a more streamlined system. There's the voter integrity and security aspect of it, as far as having voter rolls be more up to date through those automatic address updates. And that's a really important piece of it. And then I think lastly, there's the protection of non-citizens and making sure that people are not being led into a trap of being asked a citizenship question, which they might accidentally answer, as Karen pointed out, from a lack of English proficiency, being in a rush, confusion, etc., or just user error. And so this gets rid of that potential trap by just filtering out non-citizens, because the government, for the most part, already knows if you're eligible or not when you're at the DMV. And we didn't talk much about Medi-Cal or Medicaid offices, but if there's expansion to those offices, there's potential benefit there as well. So I think there's a plethora of different benefits. And I think it was kind of clear from this policy brief that we put together as we're going through the research and going through the data from Colorado that it is worth, I think, upgrading and making that change to a back-end system, even for a state like California that's done such a good job already with our voter registration system here.
And Amy, one last question. How do people read the report if they want to?
Sure. So we are releasing it today. It's public now. It is going to be available, or it is available now, at nextgenpolicy.org/AVR. We will be sending out an electronic copy to everyone who's in attendance here if you haven't had a chance to look at it. It's pretty short. We tried to make it as accessible and easy as possible. It's about, I think, 7-8 pages, some graphs and charts, and I'm happy to answer any questions after this kind of Q&A section, so people can email me if they have any other questions about it.
Fantastic. I want to thank all of you on our panel, and I want to open it up to the audience for questions. I mentioned you can ask your questions in the Q&A function on Zoom, or you can raise your hand, and Ned or Alex are hosts will spotlight you and you can ask your question to the panel. I think perhaps while we're waiting for folks to formulate questions, I have one that I wanted to ask that I forgot to ask earlier. Secretary Griswold mentioned that Colorado is improving. They're not sort of stopping with the DMV. They're moving to Medicaid. I mean, I know California offers Medicaid questions right now. What's the sort of the uptake rate on that? Do you know?
Yeah, so I think even though they are required to offer voter registration to all customers who are interacting with them, I believe that the actual adoption rate or kind of opt-in rate is about 2%. So it's extremely, extremely low. And I think this gets to all the reasons that Professor Grimmer and Karen outlined earlier, which was that people are in a rush usually when they're interacting with these agencies. They have other responsibilities. They may not understand their current status, whether they're registered or not, or whether they're even eligible. So I think the same case for doing this at the DMV, makes a lot of sense at Medicaid or in California, Medi-Cal. And just one other thing I would say about that is that the DMV, especially in California, reaches a lot of, I would say even most of the adult population in California. They're interacting either for driver's license or IDs, but it doesn't reach everyone. And working through, a Medicaid or Medi-Cal office in California is really important, I would say, next step as far as continuing to reach into the population and continuing to reach low-income voters and voters of color.
Great. We have a couple questions in the chat. We have a question. Is there any current legislation in California that would help move towards a Colorado type system? I think we've alluded to it, but yes, there is. There's SB 583, which has passed the Senate and is currently pending in the Assembly, that would move California to a Colorado style system at the DMV and would upgrade or would provide the Secretary of State the option to expand it to Medi-Cal. Somebody asked, and Professor Grimmer, I think this might be a question for you, why are declination rates so high in a front-end system? Is this just people who aren't interested in registering?
That's like one intuition we might have. Perhaps these are people who just don't want to participate in the system. But I think it's just much more likely that they're looking to get out of the DMV as quickly as possible. They've already waited in line a long time. They get to the counter, and then now they're asking, do you want to engage in another, what they might guess to be a laborious procedure to append or to get on the voter rolls? And they may already think that they're registered and up to date, even if they're not. And so my guess is that that's the primary reason that we're seeing such a high decline rate. In particular, we're seeing very few people return these mailers after the fact. So it certainly isn't the case that there is this group of people who are militantly against being on the voter rolls. So I really, really think it's just about wanting to get in and get out of the DMV as easily as possible.
Amy or Karen, anything to add on that point?
I think Professor Grimmer covered it for sure.
Another question, are other states besides California looking at transition to Colorado's form of AVR? Have others done this in addition to Colorado?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. So there are, a few states that are considering making this transition from front end to back end. Obviously, Neil just talked about California, and that's where I'm based. So that's what I care about and would love to see that happen. But Washington State is also considering it. Rhode Island, and there's a ballot initiative gathering signatures right now in Arizona. So I certainly think, Colorado is on the cutting edge, and I'd love to see, California and these other states continue to push the envelope in terms of what's possible. There was news out in 2020 that California had reached, I think, 88% voter registration rate, which was a high watermark, at least for the last 80 years. And that is an incredible accomplishment. But I think as advocates, as some of us are on this call, we're always looking to what more can we do? And I'm happy to see that other states are doing that as well. And I think just to answer the second part of the question, there are a number of states that have adopted back end. They never went through the front end system. They just jumped to that. Oregon, Nevada, Massachusetts, Delaware. I'm sure there's a Colorado, a few others that I'm missing, but there's a number of states that already have a back end system, and it's working well for them right now.
Great, and we have a question here that may be best directed to Secretary Griswold, but I'm going to put it to the panel just to see what happens. How have back-end systems been received in states like Colorado? Is it a popular policy? Amy, I wonder, Professor Grimmer, if either of you have thoughts on that.
I'll let Professor, I have some thoughts, but I'll let Professor Grimmer take this.
I actually was very curious to hear Amy's thoughts. I'm sure she's much better equipped to answer this question than me.
Sure. My understanding is that it's been very well received in Colorado. I think Secretary Griswold touched on this point, which is that voters expect their government to work for them, although I think oftentimes they have pretty low expectations about how that really works. That's what they want. They want, efficient government, and they want it to do as much as it can and not ask and create unnecessary bureaucratic processes. And we know from Oregon, which is another state that has back end, that they created a whole hotline system to deal with issues or complaints once they implemented it, and they had to shut down the hotline because no one was calling in. So I think we have seen in Colorado and other states that it's very well received, and I think people are always pleasantly surprised when things work smoothly and efficiently from their government.
I think that's right. That sort of goes back to the point we were talking about before, that people have expectations of their government. If they tell one agency that they've moved, they're sort of frustrated to find out that they need to tell a separate agency, and those two agencies aren't talking to each other, which I think is sort of one of the ideas behind this system.
I would just add that spending less time at the DMV with better results is going to poll very well all the time.
That's probably a safe assumption, yeah. Another person asks, can we just discuss more the protections for non-citizens through back-end AVR, particularly in regards to potential for human error? Amy and Karen, I'm going to put that one to the two of you to sort of reiterate those protections and sort of discuss them more.
Yeah, so backend relies on verified documents to automatically filter non-citizens out of the registration system. So in contrast, the California current system as non-citizens if they want to register to vote. So instead of putting it in the hands of the people, the government is automatically doing the work for them. And I think this is just gonna simplify it for a lot of reasons. One, language barriers is one of them. Two, people just don't want to have to make decisions when they're at the DMV. They might be flustered with the long forms, like Professor Griswold mentioned. So I think just from me working with the community, I think that they might just be afraid to answer questions. Also, to the government question, there's a lot of distrust of government amongst minorities, and especially people who are non-citizens, just because of their fear of deportation or many other reasons.
I think that makes total sense. I can imagine sort of a citizenship question, in addition to having this potential for human error, also has a chilling effect. Somebody sees a citizenship question on a form, they're less likely to apply for that government service if they're concerned about answering that question. So to the extent that, if the state has that information already as part of the transaction, avoiding that potential for human error, avoiding that potential for a person to drop off the form, to drop off from completing the form, that seems like another benefit here. Sort of the flip side of that, Arturo asks, is this system too automatic? Is there a concern that adding voters, too passively to the rolls, are those people going to be less engaged? Are they going to be less likely to vote? Amy and Professor Grimmer, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that one.
I'll take a first crack at it. Certainly, that's an intuition that some folks have had. That perhaps we need to have some procedures in place in order to ensure that people are engaged. And it turns out all of the research points in the other direction. That what goes on in U.S. elections is that individuals get very engaged, and they get very engaged in the immediate run up to the election, and in particular in the last 2 weeks before an election. But at that point, in many states, it's already too late to be registered to vote, or it imposes upon individuals a serious hurdle to overcome, or it just adds so much to even states with same-day registration. When they show up, it's just too much, and they're not able to turn out to vote.
Or they don't receive a mail ballot in a state like California.
Yeah, exactly. In a state like California, that'll mail you a ballot, you never receive it, and therefore you're sort of left out of this excellent reminder about an election that's coming up. And so all of the evidence seems to go in the other direction, that that we're not encouraging engagement by erecting hurdles to participation. In fact, all we're doing is excluding people from the process who are in fact engaged and do care and want their choices that they have a constitutional right to select. They want to be able to make those choices.
I want to highlight a couple of things. So since California started sending vote by mail ballots to voters, a lot more people started voting, and they weren't waiting until election day to vote. As soon as they received the ballots, you see the ballots being returned within 3 days. When we started in California, we have in-person voting up to 10 days in select counties. People started voting as soon as these voting centers open in person. With these options being available to voters, more people are participating in this electoral process because they're not limited to 1 day of voting, which is election day from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. at their voting location in which they live locally. So giving all these options to people, one, sending them their ballot automatically is gonna give them like hey, you received this, now it's your turn to vote. Then it also allows for organizations like Chilla and other nonprofit organizations, candidates, campaigns, a lot more other options to like reach out to these voters, whether it's by making calls to them, whether it's by sending them a text message, whether it's by sending them a mailer at their home address, or whether it's by making a phone call to them. They can receive multiple touches from different campaigns, organizations, so that they're more likely to go out and vote, and we can focus on spending our time and energy in turning out those voters to participate in the democracy.
So registration is really the gateway to everything. It's the gateway to being mailed a ballot. It's the gateway to showing up and having no issues on election day. It's the gateway to civic outreach by both field organizations and by government officials. And what I'm hearing is if that registration happens as early as possible with the best data possible, that's sort of a boon to organizations like Chilla's.
And if I could add just one point to that, you're talking about making sure people are registered as early as possible, and that really starts with pre-registration. And I think just turning back to Colorado, that's why it was so encouraging to see such high pre-registration rates under the back-end system, because you want people to start voting as soon as they turn 18 and really establish it as a lifelong habit. And the sooner you do that, the better.
Just to hit on that pre-registration point again, it makes so much sense because a person is going in, getting their first driver's license at 16, they're eligible for pre-registration. They're providing all the documentation they need to know if they are eligible to register to vote or not. Just capturing them at that point, at that first interaction, is really sort of going to set them up for a lifetime of voting, it sounds like.
Yeah, I think that's right.
We're coming up on time. I want to just give our panelists an opportunity to sort of give any kind of closing remarks, just a few sentences if they'd like to, and thank them again for a really great panel today. Professor Grimmer, I'll start with you.
Thanks. Yeah, it's rare to see a policy, as the Secretary of State mentioned, that increases security and increases participation. And this is a policy that does that. It expands the electorate. It offers safeguards to a number of communities, and so this is I think a really great opportunity for California and other states.
Thanks so much, Karen.
I hope that this can become a reality. As someone who helps people go out and vote in every election, and particularly the Spanish community, we want to create a culture of going out and voting in every election. Some of our community members might not even have a education that goes beyond second grade. They might not able to read or write, but this is just going to make it significantly simpler for them to be able to not just vote in presidential elections, primary elections, special elections, but we can also reach out to them off election years and invite them to participate in processes like census and redistricting, which they might never heard of before, and demystifying these difficult processes.
Thanks so much. Amy, I'm going to give the last word to you.
Sure. Well, in the words of Secretary Griswold, this is a win-win-win-win. Maybe there's one more win. There's a lot of wins. And I think because of that, the policy of back-end automatic voter registration just makes all the sense in the world. And just one of those wins, I would say, that we didn't touch on to just answer a final question that I saw in the Q&A was about reducing time and kind of wait times at the DMV. And we didn't really get to talk about that, but I would just say that's an additional win, is that if you move to a back-end system, it frees up time spent at the DMV, and DMV workers certainly like that. And I think the general public likes that too.
A great note to end on. And with that, I just want to thank everybody, especially our panelists, for making time today. We hope this has been a useful discussion. And as Amy mentioned, the report is available, so folks should really take a look at it. It's really some really interesting findings. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.